is James Jones. He's an assistant professor of African American Studies and Sociology, and he's at Rutgers, Newark. And let me introduce your title, too. Race to Power, Challenging Institutional Inequality in the United States Congress.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be a part of this conference on diversity and inclusion. I want to first start off by thanking the organizers, Barbara Lee and Richard and Isabel, for this invitation and for the distinct honor of having to follow Nancy Cantor and Carla O'Connor, people I really respect and admire. So my presentation is going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to necessarily talk about higher education or even middle schools, but another institution where there's a lack of diversity, but where the implications of it are pretty high. And my research focuses on United States Congress. Joey, an administrative employee in Congress, said this: "It's a plantation, man, because all the work is done behind the scenes, is done by blacks. Whites maintain the visible face of Congress. All the people who work in the kitchens and who clean the bathrooms are black. And those who work in the members' offices are like those who work in the big house." Now, as the center of federal legislative power and as one of the most representative sites of our democratic values, Congress is not often described as a plantation. However, conducting field work in Congress for almost 5 years, I found that this was a frequent way to describe the racial dynamics of the legislature. Today, I'll present some research from my current book project, The Last Plantation, which investigates racial inequality in the congressional workforce. Now, the title is a little bit provocative, but it's meant to illuminate the contours of Congress as a racialized space. I found that people of color are missing from the most senior and influential roles in Congress. But I'll also argue that the solution to such systemic inequality cannot be limited to just elevating black and brown faces to important positions. But we must critically assess how power is distributed in our governing political institutions more broadly, remaking them in ways that strengthen our democracy and empower marginalized communities. Now, the dishonorable title, The Last Plantation, is not one that I've given to Congress myself, right? It's one that lawmakers and their own staffers have applied to the legislature. Now, before we unpack why they would sort of make such a designation, it's important to understand how Congress exists as a workplace, one where thousands of employees work on Capitol Hill. Congressional staffers are the invisible force in American policymaking. When a constituent writes a letter to their representative or their senator, it's the staff that writes back. When lobbyists meet in congressional offices, they're most often meeting with a staffer that works on an issue related to their agenda. When a congressperson speaks during a hearing and it goes viral, it's the staffer that has prepared the remarks. Well, unless you're Maxine Waters. But it's the fact that the staffer has actually organized the entire hearing. Now, this is not to say that members of Congress are not the principal actors on Capitol Hill, but it's the staffers who present the options and the recommendations, who construct the agendas, and who implement the decisions. Although Congress or congressional staffers occupy this principal role in legislative decision-making, it is one of the least diverse workplaces in the country. Now, what's behind this inequality is an institution that plays by its own set of rules and imposes another set of rules on everyone else, right? So, for instance, in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, right, which was removing barriers for women and minorities more broadly to enter the workplace. It also created the EEOC to collect demographic data, right, as a tool to prevent discrimination in hiring and promotions. However, this is a law that isn't applied to Congress, right? There's this sort of rationale that Congress is going to exempt itself to preserve a balance of power between them, and the executive agencies which are in charge in enforcing this. This is what led Senator John Glenn, the late astronaut senator, to call the Congress the last plantation in 1978, right? As he imagined, or as he said in a congressional hearing, it's like a doctor prescribing a prescription to his patient that he himself would not take. Now, as Congress has moved to rid the workplaces more broadly of discrimination of the country, and to make them more safer and equal, it's consciously decided not to do that for its own employees. Now, almost 2 decades later, in 1993, Congress passed the Congressional Accountability Act. It applied 13 federal workplace laws to Congress. However, still exempted from that was the responsibility of collecting demographic data on its employees. So it's not surprising in 2006 when Diversity Inc. looked at the congressional workplace, and particularly in the Senate, it found that the Senate had a worse record on diversity than the top 50 corporations in the United States. The lack of transparency in congressional employment prevents accountability and allows inequality to persist. Now, I sought to provide an updated assessment of the racial demographics of the congressional workplace as it pertains to my research. Now, I tried different approaches to collect this data. I tried surveys, I tried in-person interviews, but with each approach, I encountered many obstacles. Congressional staffers, and I used to be one of them, they weren't really helpful participants. They were told it was against office policy to participate in social scientific research. They were scared about and paranoid about how it would treat such sensitive data as race and gender that was obviously observable. And on a few occasions, I was met with skepticism and even sometimes with vitriol. Now, the process to collecting this data was difficult and frustrating, but I realized the data that I was not getting was actually data. Right? In this case, what these research obstacles signaled was just not that people of color didn't occupy top staff positions. I knew that, people in DC knew that anecdotally. But in many ways, it revealed how Congress was an institution that operated in secret, and it wanted to remain that way. Eventually, I produced a policy paper for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies on racial diversity in the top Senate staff positions, right? So this is the first racial census in 10 years in Congress. I looked at the most senior people in the Senate, right? So these are chiefs of staff, legislative directors, communications directors, and staff directors of committees, right? As one of my participants said, these are people who have real power. They're breathing a sort of rarefied air, right? So in 336 people in total, I found that people of color only accounted for about 7% of those positions, even though people of color make up over a third of the population. Again, this is like dated data from 2015 when I did this. Now, to produce my findings, I had to be a little bit creative, right? I used publicly reported personnel data to do online searches to find personal photos of staffers, which I could then use to identify their race. So I took your name, I looked at your Facebook profile, your Twitter, your wedding announcements, any type of news stuff on BuzzFeed. This is why you should make things private for researchers like me. But again, it revealed the extent to which Congress was not a workplace that reflected the rich diversity of the country. Particularly as you sort of drilled down in the data, it became even more depressing, right? We can think about this in a sort of intersectional lens, right? 7% of people of color who work in these top staff positions, but they were mostly men, right? Women of color were absent. They only occupied 3% of those top staff positions. I looked at the top 10 states where Latinos and African Americans live, right? And you would expect, since they're overrepresented in these states, right? And their populations or percentages range from 15 to 40%. Again, they were missing from those Senate offices where you would expect them to be. Again, we could think about this in sort of a partisan way, right? Where you would expect the Democrats, who are the big party of diversity, to have an overrepresentation of African Americans and Latinos, right? African Americans make up 22% of the Democratic Party and 13% for Latinos. But blacks and Latinos only made up 2% respectively of those top staff positions. Now, for 2 years, this report has gained a lot of attention. And admirably, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer implemented some of my policy recommendations within the Democratic caucus. And because of this spotlight, there's even more Black and Latino staffers in key positions than when I first examined this in 2015. However, this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue, but really what it represents is an institutional failure. As such, I propose an institutional fix. To achieve racial inequality in the congressional workplace, Congress must act to end its own double standard, which allows it to operate as a privileged workplace and with its own set of rules. So this would mean collecting demographic data. That's very simple, but it also keeps the bar very, very low. More importantly, as an institution that represents our values, Congress should become a model for what fair and equal employment looks like. Again, sort of echoing Nancy Cantor, we could look at this as a challenge or a challenge to build our democracy or a threat. Again, what's at stake is just not the jobs for elite few. This is not why I do this research, right? But it's the quality of representation that we all receive as citizens. As such, I theorize Congress as an inequality regime, one in which race, gender, and class are all constitutive elements in this institutional space. The racial and gender and class makeup shape the conduct of legislative business, influencing debate and legislation. Inequality here is then amplified as Congress serves as this sort of credentialing institution that trains political professionals for more even elite and powerful positions in the American political system. Whether it's going to work in the White House or in an executive agency, sometimes running these departments, going to clerk in the Supreme Court, or even being a Supreme Court justice themselves, former staffers, going to run a campaign or run for office themselves on the local, state, or federal level, or even going to work in advocacy. The inequality in Congress all but ensures that more powerful and political workplaces are white dominated, right? And so in many ways, this sort of shapes the way that which we view Congress as an institution, one that has low trust and low approval because it's seen as a space for the influential and well-connected. I found that staffers improve the quality or diversity, or should I say, I have found that staffers of color improve the quality of debate and deliberation in Congress. And they actually work to strengthen the relationships between communities of color and white lawmakers. And this way, they also challenge the racial and gender norms that shape how Congress as an institution works, right? And so in this way, we can imagine Congress as a space for minority empowerment, all right, with more diverse perspectives, right? Congress is seen as more legitimate and fair, right? We are expanding access to democratic institutions through this hiring process. And in this way, it enhances substantive citizenship. Now, in my research, I center the experiences and perspectives of African American employees in Congress. And similar others who work in the halls of power, but who have little to no power themselves. Their dissenting points of views force a reconceptualization of how Congress as an institution works. They are the canaries in the mine. We must listen to their experiences and follow their trail because they are signaling that there is danger in our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, James.